You ever just stumble across a new game that you were completely and utterly unaware of, only to find yourself proclaiming its greatness just a couple hours later? This was my experience with Labyrinth of the Demon King. This game was a complete and total surprise, just some random new indie project that I had never heard of. I was scrolling on the PlayStation Store looking for something new to play, something to review, and fully expecting to find nothing that interests me, as that's usually how it goes. My taste in video games is highly idiosyncratic. I will just not give most things a chance. I mean, I'm open to a pretty broad variety of different genres, different experiences, but within this spectrum, my actual standard for what I think is good or interesting is extremely narrow. Whatever it is that I'm actually looking for in a video game, it's definitely something really specific, something hard to define. And to be honest, I rarely ever find it. But in this case, right away the game intrigued me with its awesome visuals. It's got this really cool PlayStation 1 era graphics presentation, which, to be fair, isn't exactly novel at this point. Other developers are also doing this. But the execution is just so strong and measured. It's just dark and serious and not at all cheesy, which is something I'm really sensitive to. Like, I hate everything. I'm really susceptible to perceiving almost everything as cringe. And so I tend to be really impressed when I find something that doesn't trigger this response, right? In this case, I knew straight away that I wanted to play this game, and I'm happy to report that it did not disappoint. Now, I don't think it's perfect or anything, and I will point out some things I took issue with, but it's a strong effort. This is a really cohesive package that is clearly the result of a lot of hard work. I found it to be compelling the whole way through, and I'm more than happy to give praise where it is warranted. So, without further introduction, I present my review for Labyrinth of the Demon King. So, what exactly is this game? Labyrinth of the Demon King is a new indie title that looks to be the one-man project of a guy who calls himself J.R. Hudepol. Hudepol? Which I think is German, maybe? Anyway, the official description labels it as a challenging first-person dungeon crawler, which is accurate, but there's also an undeniable and very prominent survival horror component to this game, to the extent that I don't think I would recommend it to people who are not fans of that genre. Everything from the atmosphere to the level design, the kinds of puzzles the game employs, with the cryptic notes scattered everywhere, to me the intention is clear. Perhaps the creator or publisher didn't want to label it as survival horror for marketing purposes or something, I guess there's no way to be sure. And from the most classical perspective of survival horror, I suppose it's not a perfect fit. Like, it really doesn't have a challenging limitation on inventory space, and it doesn't emphasize resource management too much either. But overall, I think it slots well into that category. The game is set in some otherworldly, demon-ridden version of feudal Japan, where you play as a random soldier who embarks on a journey of sorts in one of the most unfortunate locations imaginable, where of course his ultimate goal is to kill the titular Demon King. This is a game that focuses on melee combat and exploration. Some people say the gameplay is reminiscent of Kingsfield, which is kind of the spiritual precursor to From Software's Souls games, if you're unaware. On a surface level examination, it does look fairly similar, so this seems like it could be true, but I've personally never played any of the Kingsfield games, so I'm not really looking to comment on that. What I have played is many hundreds of hours of the great PS3 masterpiece, Demon's Souls, and there are plenty of similarities here. I might even say the apparent influence feels obvious. So that's more the lens I tend to view this game through, and it's a comparison I will bring up several times throughout the video. It kind of feels like if the developer made Demon's Souls first person and heavily minimized the RPG elements, and then reconceptualized the game as a Silent Hill-esque survival horror title. It feels like something in that ballpark. This absolutely works in my opinion. I'm fully on board with all of it. As I mentioned earlier, the approach to art direction is fantastic as well. It has this ultra-dark, grainy, grimy look to it, with great audio that perfectly matches the atmosphere suggested by the visuals. It also has these very cool, sparse cutscenes which generally introduce new enemy types or boss fights. These short cinematics are just super creepy and filthy and pixelated, and the, I guess you could say, cinematography in these brief scenes feels pretty thoughtful as well. From an audio-visual perspective, I think the game is pretty much flawless. And really just in general, I think as a concept for a video game, as an aesthetic package, the developer really nailed what he was going for. The gameplay featured in Labyrinth of the Demon King, on the one hand, involves fighting enemies, of course, and on the other involves navigating confusing environments while solving puzzles. I'm going to tackle the combat and its related systems first. So, the game's melee combat is, to a certain extent, similar to that of Demon's Souls, featuring an iteration on the light attack, strong attack, parry, and dodge paradigm that From Software has become known for. It also features a kick move, which is reminiscent of the push mechanic in Demon's Souls and the kick from Dark Souls. On top of this, the combat system is heavily regulated by a stamina meter, just like we see in many of From Software's titles. So there are clear similarities here. However, the application of these systems in Labyrinth seems to have kind of a different intent, leaning more towards survival horror and perhaps further away from pure action. Like, fighting is engaging and it's satisfying to a certain extent, but I don't think it's intended to be fun in the way that combat is fun in action games. Like, the combat is not exactly center stage. It's more so just another obstacle for the player to contend with on his journey. I actually think Demon's Souls shares this quality, and it's one of the things I really love about that game that FromSoft has largely abandoned in their later projects, favoring a more and more explicitly action-oriented experience as time goes on. Labyrinth takes this stuff much further though, with gameplay that, as I was saying, emphasizes more of a disempowered, survival horror-esque fighting experience. The player is handicapped in several ways that we don't see in From Software's work, and your character's agility and fluidity of movement are much more constrained here. As a stark example of this, you walk backwards extremely slowly in this game, which basically prevents the player from backpedaling during a fight and tyrannically forces him to engage with the game's core combat mechanics as they were intended. So Labyrinth doesn't give you really any wiggle room to fight outside of the basic intended structure. You either fight to the death within the kick, parry, dodge framework or run away. The creator was clearly going for a really specific experience here, and it's also possible he was afraid the game might be too easy if he did it another way. He wants you to die, is what it is. Regardless of skill or anything like that, he wants you to struggle. I think that's the point. This is a horror game. Furthermore, the stamina meter absolutely destroys you in this game. It is an extremely oppressive system which runs out very quickly in combat and is slow to regenerate. It is much more punishing than its Demon's Souls counterpart. This was also, of course, a highly intentional design choice, which is meant to disempower the player even further. I think overall it works pretty well, as it really helps to keep the tension high, and something like this was probably necessary to maintain the intended combat experience. To be honest though, it is a little annoying. Most of my deaths resulted from running out of stamina. There are consumable items available to help you with stamina regen, which are highly necessary for many fights due to the nature of the system. Also, sprinting does not consume stamina, but it prevents regen, so it's important to remember to walk a bit in between combat encounters to get that meter back up. An item called Ritual Essence that's found in the world enables you to kind of level up your character when offered at a shrine, which is a save point. Each time you make an offering, you can choose to increase either health or stamina. My recommendation is to greatly favor stamina, and probably to put several points into that before you even consider augmenting your health. For some reason, this didn't occur to me until near the end of the game, and throughout my playthrough I upgraded each of them fairly evenly, which I don't think I'd recommend. Your health bar doesn't matter for shit when you're out of stamina. As I said earlier, you have a light attack and a strong attack, which is performed by holding the light attack button, so it's kind of charging it up, and then you release the button to deploy your attack. The strong attack does significantly more damage, and it will also break an enemy's guard, which is nice. The kick is extremely useful as well. It deals damage and forcefully pushes enemies back to create space between you and your opponents, which gets them out of your face and can give you time to charge up a strong attack as well. I recommend liberal use of the kick function. It's just really good. And of course, the game has a parry. The inevitable parry system, which every game must include. All must assimilate or be destroyed. We will parry enemies in every single video game for the rest of our lives. There is no hope of escape. No, but it actually doesn't irritate me too much here, and I think it's perhaps more appropriate and maybe less forced in this game than it is in many others. The parry window is exceedingly generous, which I think makes sense in this context, as it essentially just replaces the block button. It's like the creator wanted you to have a concrete defensive option, but he also didn't want you to be able to just hold the block button and bypass tons of damage, right? So he just has the block require a specific timing in order to be effective, which keeps pressure on the player and maintains tension in combat. It's a way to prevent blocking from being too powerful. This is my opinion anyway. Maybe he really is just hopping on the bandwagon. I'm trying not to be cynical. Either way, I think it works fine. The dodge mechanic is also fine. It's a dodge and works as a dodge should. Overall, I think I would have preferred a combat structure that's a little more freeform, maybe something more rooted in spacing and movement rather than parrying and dodging, maybe even with a slightly more action-oriented focus. I just feel like more fun could have been squeezed from this battle system, and I think this could have been done while still retaining the game's central vision and purpose. Of course, a lot of things would have needed to be adjusted to make this work, and I'm not trying to knock what's here. This is just my personal preference. I think the system is very solid as it is. I do think it feels a little stilted, a little janky, but I'm actually alright with that, and I think it may have even been intentional. I think it's clear the developer wanted us to feel disempowered. He wanted death to come easily. And the system he ended up with definitely achieves that experience. Fighting is fierce and tense. Every hit the player takes is significant. So it really does have a respectable level of intensity. It's hard hitting and fairly satisfying, while still effectively making the player feel weak and disadvantaged before his enemies. The combat, while not flawless, I must admit fits perfectly within the aesthetic bounds set by the game's creator, and I think on balance it's definitely a strength for the game. I also found the enemies to be pretty engaging, as they hit hard and many of them have similar abilities to the player, so you really have to pay strict attention to what your opponent is doing. If you don't deploy the right move at the right time, this can rapidly spiral and have you cascading towards a quick death, especially given the brutal stamina system and the game's tendency to constantly inflict status effects, which also have to be managed with consumables. So there's kind of a lot to consider. Enemies are lethal, and I found the variety of different types to be respectable for a game of this size. Their designs are solid, and I think they're able to meaningfully add variation to the combat as well. Enemy spawns seem to be somewhat randomized, and they become more numerous as the game progresses. One thing I really enjoyed is the tendency for enemies to fight each other to the death, which is interesting and actually serves an important purpose. The combat system was clearly designed for one-on-one fighting, so I think he included this as a way to have multiple enemies per encounter without overwhelming the player too much, as you can often bait enemies into fighting each other and then simply finish off the victor. So I think this was really smart, and it also just adds to the frenzied nature of this world and its gameplay. The melee weapons all feel pretty satisfying to wield and have unique traits like feel, speed, damage, etc. There are plenty of them to collect, and there's actually an NPC that will upgrade them for you, which is a nice touch, so you can individualize the combat a bit more. The game does feature a couple ranged weapons, which are powerful but slow, so they are best used at a distance. I largely just saved the ammunition for boss fights, as you cannot carry very much of it. There is also kind of a rudimentary magic system. Consumable items called talismans can be found in the world, which give the player access to various different spells and are generally one-time use. I didn't use these much, and I don't really have much of an opinion. But yeah, overall, I think all of this stuff is pretty successful and well thought out, even if some of it doesn't perfectly align with my personal preferences. Next, I want to take a special look at how saving your game works and how it affects gameplay. So there is an autosave system in place very much like the one featured in the Souls series, which automatically saves almost everything you do. Therefore, you lose zero progress of any kind on death, nothing. So when you manually save at the shrines placed throughout the world, you aren't actually saving progress. You are essentially just selecting the location you will respawn at when you die. This means that manual saves are completely unnecessary much of the time, as their primary function isn't even really to save your game. All forms of progress are saved automatically. So nothing at all is lost on death, and therefore, sometimes it is actually beneficial to the player to just die and respawn at full health, especially considering the relatively small size of the environment. I'm not totally sure how I feel about this. So I think Labyrinth's creator intended that people were going to die a lot in this game, so he implemented the save system in this way to prevent the experience from being too frustrating and repetitive, which I actually agree with and fully support. Still, it does feel odd that there is virtually zero punishment for death in a game which is otherwise a fairly punishing and hardcore experience. I think he should have kept the save system in place, but maybe developed a more creative punishment for death to be overlaid on top. A good example of something like this is the tendency system from, you guessed it, Demon's Souls, which has the potential to make the game harder on death, but also has other effects as well, such as tendency-specific world events that might be beneficial to the player. A lot of people hate this system as it's never really explained in-game and is super punishing for new players. but I love it. It's a really interesting idea that only makes Demon's Souls more unique. Like, it adds depth, it adds an extra layer to the gameplay, and it represents a creative decision that would have never occurred to most developers. Anyway, I'm not trying to say Labyrinth should use this same system, I just think there is probably a creative solution out there that would enable a more substantial punishment for death while keeping the autosave system intact. I think something like this could be really interesting in a sequel or a similar game from this creator in the future. Now it's time to discuss this game's approach to level design and some other related elements. Right away, I just want to say I think this stuff is handled well. I think the spaces look great and are interesting to explore. The overall structure of the world is presented as a single contiguous map with 3 main dungeons and a few exterior connecting areas, and it allows for full backtracking, so you can travel back to any earlier parts of the world whenever you please, which is a nice touch. There's also a hub area where you can buy items, upgrade your weapons, and even drink tea. Again, very much like Demon's Souls, NPCs you find out in the world will often be sent back to this hub area where they will remain for the rest of the game for you to interact with at your leisure. The level design for the main dungeons reminds me a lot of Silent Hill 2, which I like. The actual layouts are relatively intricate and often require a convoluted path to reach the end. So Labyrinth makes frequent use of the Metroidvania-esque level progression that is common in survival horror, where you will often come across areas that cannot be accessed until later after finding some item or solving a puzzle. There are a lot of similarities to other games here, but regardless, I do think there's kind of a distinct flavor to the structure of this game. The puzzles are fairly standard for this sort of title, and I generally enjoyed them, with most being kind of navigation-based, like just figuring out where to go or what item you need or how to get from point A to point B, though there are some more interesting puzzles as well. There were exactly 2 points where I was lost and frustrated and almost resorted to looking up the solution, once towards the end of the bathhouse section and once in the final dungeon, but I ultimately persevered and made it through. You really just have to make sure you visit each room and pay close attention to both your surroundings and the key items in your inventory. If you maintain this habit, you will eventually figure out what you're supposed to do. This is easier said than done, however, as the map system is a major contributor to the difficulty of both navigation and progression. The map is remarkably stingy in terms of the information it offers, especially in comparison to what we see in most similar games of the modern era. It pretty much just highlights the room you're in, with an occasional question mark symbol denoting important areas, and that's all you get. As I was saying, it merely highlights the room you are currently in, so it doesn't show your character's position or orientation in the room, and it also doesn't indicate which rooms you have or have not been to in any way, or even reveal which doors are locked or unlocked, and it is never updated with any kind of new information. It's a pretty inconvenient system, so you're going to be constantly looking at this map because that's just the nature of the gameplay, and much of the time you will have to take a second to figure out which part of the room you're actually in and which way your character is facing before the map becomes useful. So this makes it extremely easy to get turned around and to forget where you have and haven't been, and sometimes even makes it difficult to remember how to reach areas you've already been to. So really, this map system kind of smears a thick layer of confusion over the whole experience, and I'm sure this was highly deliberate on the part of the developer to make the game more challenging. It took me maybe 9 or 9.5 hours to complete the game, and it's possible that at least a couple hours plus might have been shaved off with a more straightforward, informative map system. But the point is, this game is something like survival horror, right? That is the intent. Challenge is the intent. So this was clearly a calculated disadvantage to make the experience more confusing and basically to increase the suffering of the player. There were certainly points where I found it frustrating, but honestly, I fully support the decision to do it this way, and I think it has the intended effect. Our friend JR obviously wanted to craft a more hardcore experience, and sometimes you have to do potentially unpopular things like this to achieve the desired result. So I think it's a good fit, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time exploring this world. So what is the verdict here? How good is this game actually, and should people buy it? Well, I think the conclusion here is rather uncomplicated. There are some things that diverge from my personal preferences, some things I would have done differently if it were my game, and it does have a subtle amateurishness to it, but there's really nothing wrong with that, and honestly, it's hard to even qualify exactly what I mean by that. It really is rather tight and seamless, and I was genuinely impressed. Even though much of this stuff kind of does feel transparently derived from other games, in a sense, like some of its influences are obvious, and it's not really innovative in any particular way, I just don't think that matters. As a whole, the experience still feels fresh and the execution is strong. I think the atmosphere he was able to cultivate here is really effective. It's just a good game. There is an authentic vision that shines through. Like, there's a certain creative passion here that is just really obvious to me. It's the kind of thing I often look for but rarely find, and thus I have a lot of admiration for the person who developed this game. I look forward to whatever he does next. For any prospective players, I'd say you really can't go wrong here, especially considering the $20 price point. Labyrinth of the Demon King is perhaps the most pleasant surprise I've come across in a long time, and I think anybody who's interested should buy it without hesitation. Anyway, that's going to be it for this one. Subscribe to my channel and let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Let me know what you think of Labyrinth of the Demon King if you've played it. Thank you very much for watching.